Welcome back. Bio Happy Monday. It is April 27th. Hard to believe we are that far into the month of April already. We are continuing our discussion today on the crayfish, starting with the digestive system of the crayfish. As a final reminder, don't forget to complete, if you have not already, the vocab for this module and to complete that test on Quizlet so I can give you credit. All right, so let's dive into this. It's only a couple short slides as we wrap up the intricacies of the crayfish. So crayfish are considered scavengers because they will consume anything basically that can be digested. They are basically not picky eaters. A crayfish is going to use its mandibles to break food into small chunks, much like we use our own jaw or our own mandible as humans to chop up our own food. From there, food that is broken into those small chunks is going to enter a short esophagus, similar to what we have as well as an esophagus. Then that enters into the stomach, which consists of two regions. The first is on the anterior side of the crayfish, and this is where food is ground into fine particles. And then the second is on the posterior side of the crayfish, which then sorts those particles that have been ground up. Some particles are sent directly to the digestive glands, which secrete enzymes, much like our own stomachs secrete digestive enzymes to break up the food that we take in. If the particles are too large for immediate digestion, and that's what's determined up here in that second portion of the stomach as it's being sorted, if they're sorted and determined to be too large for immediate digestion, they're going to get sent to the intestine. There, it's exposed to enzymes, which then can digest those larger particles. And anything that's not able to be digested at that point is just going to remain in the intestine before it's expelled through the anus as fecal matter. Okay, so now talking about the nervous system of the crayfish. The nervous system is composed of two ganglia, each with a nerve cord that runs along the ventral side and is joined together. Again, remember that ventral side's the underside. That's a distinguishing characteristic of arthropods. And so the crayfish is no different. At regular intervals, those ganglia will continually process signals that are running down the nerve cord. And so that's feeding its brain, if you will, or these two ganglia, the information it needs about what's going on around it. Okay, remember we said that crayfish have 6 sets of appendages? And so those appendages function to send as like sensory organs to send that information to the nervous system so the crayfish can sense things like taste, touch, and so on and so forth. The crayfish has a set of compound eyes which sends information to its brain. The attenuals and the antennae send the taste and touch information, and tiny bristles that are found all over the crayfish's body provide a strong sense of touch for the crayfish. And this is really necessary because if you think about it, the exoskeleton is super hard. It's made of that chitin, and so that's not going to be a really good sense of touch. So it needs these tiny bristles to be sensory receptors so it knows where it is, what it's touching, is there a predator around, and so on and so forth. Each of those antennuals has what's called a statocyst, which helps the crayfish maintain its balance. Basically, it's little tiny containers lined with tiny hairs that provide that sense of touch and balance for the crayfish as it moves around. Inside each of these hair-lined containers is what's called a grain of sand or a statolith. And this shifts when it's knocked off balance. So as it shifts, this little grain of sand is going to indicate kind of where spatially the crayfish is and keep it balanced. All right, moving on to the reproductive system of the crayfish. The reproduction begins in the gonad of the crayfish, which produces its gametes. Okay, the gonad is just that general term for the organ that produces gametes. In males, that's the testes. In females, that's the ovary. So in the males, the sperm formed in the gonad is transferred to the first and the second pairs of the swimmerets, usually sometime in the fall. And so if you go back to the slides that we did when we talked about the function of each of the swimmerettes, we said that one of the functions was for reproduction. So this is where that comes into play here. The male will deposit the sperm into special containers that are located on the female crayfish. And the females, as we said, they have the ovary, which stores the sperm until spring. When spring rolls around, the female is going to produce eggs out of its ovary, which travel through the oviduct and are fertilized by that sperm that they've been carrying around from the males. The fertilized eggs then attach to the female's swimmerettes. That's where it comes into play for the females here. And they develop approximately 6 weeks on those swimmerettes before the eggs are capable of hatching. Basically, in a crawfish, the newborns are miniature versions of their parents and typically cling to their mother for many weeks after they hatch. And another fun fact is that during the first year of life, the average crayfish will molt roughly 7 times due to severe rapid growth. And the average crayfish will live typically to be about 4 to 8 years old. So this is just some examples from your book of some other crustaceans that fall under this category. They all have distinguishing features that make them different from the crayfish, but the crayfish is used in biology as a good model because they're easily accessible and they contain most of these distinguishing crustacean characteristics that we've talked about. So they're a good study for a high school student to get a sense of exactly what makes other crustaceans unique in God's creation. So things like the spiny lobster, shrimp, a crab, and even barnacles fall under the crustacean category. Okay, so let's end with a quick fact check, and then I do have a very important video that I would like you to watch that I'm linking below that is vital to wrapping up the crayfish before we start on the next lesson. So, number 1 says that although the gills of a crayfish appear to be working fine, the crayfish suffocates because it cannot get fresh water into the gill chamber. What organs are not working properly? Most likely, the swimmerettes and the maxillae must not be working because those are the 2 organs that are responsible for moving that fresh water into the gill chamber. Number 2, trace the flow of blood from the pericardial sinus and back again. Mention the following organs when you do so: the pericardial sinus, the sternal sinus, the green glands, heart, and gills. So, first, blood will collect in the pericardial sinus. Next, it proceeds to the heart, where blood is pumped through the open-ended vessels and dumped into the tissues. Next, it collects in the sternal sinus before being picked up by vessels that take blood to the gills to absorb oxygen and rid of waste. Second to lastly, the blood gets cleaned in that green gland for impurities before it heads back to the pericardial sinus for repeating that cycle. Okay, so make sure that you can trace that blood flow through the crayfish. Number 3, it says I actually wrote crawfish, but I meant crayfish. Same difference. A crayfish loses its claw in a fight. What will happen? Okay, so remember the membrane is going to close off because it's a double membrane and seal off the hole, and the claw will eventually regenerate. And lastly, number 4, if a crayfish cannot stay upright in the water, what organ is most likely not working? That would be the statocyst. That's likely malfunctioning to some degree because that is what helps to maintain its balance with that grain of sand that keeps it in check. Okay, so on Wednesday we will not have another slide video lesson. Instead, you will be receiving in your email a video that you need to watch and some questions that you need to answer, which will be a virtual crayfish dissection completed by another teacher that I have located on YouTube. So you are going to be watching that and answering some questions about that. And when you have finished, you are going to be sending me your work. So keep an eye out in your email for that, and I will see you back on Friday for another video and some more slides.